Let's get this intellectual party started. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. All right. So, brother, on your website, you describe yourself as a fine artist, illustrator, Eisner-Award-winning cartoonist, passion for creativity. Let's begin with the value of creativity in our lives. And this is something I have also contemplated and processed obsessively in my own creativity. There have been many artists, creative scientists, and other practitioners, probably starting with the likes of Flora Bowley, who emphasized the power of how creativity can save or save the world. George Lewis tells us the creative act, the feat of habit, by originality overcomes everything. Even Einstein has agreed that imagination is more important than knowledge. These thinkers all point congruently to the idea passion or creativity is not just a hobby, but shapes purpose. And it's also a mechanism by which we can navigate crises and maintain mental well-being. What are some of your overarching underlying reasons or resolutions that drive your creativity and shape its purpose?
Um, it's a great question. First of all, good afternoon, everyone. So for me, I feel like I don't know. I feel blessed in a lot of ways because I think a lot of people in their lives are searching for what they want to do or are supposed to do. For me, it kind of was more a matter of like which creative avenue I was going to explore. And I know I'm speaking maybe in terms of like career, which we're too often, you know, led to think about, you know, a career, you got to survive, obviously. But I do look at creativity, as you were saying, like beyond just like work and money. And so for me, creativity like when I was young, not only did I like to draw and create things, but I really just, I don't know, it was one of those people where I was kind of magnetically drawn to other people's creations. And I'm talking about like all of the arts. So visual arts, like I loved comic books. You know, obviously I loved, but you know, if I would come across painting, drawing, you know, out in the world, I would love it. And then at a certain point, you know, musically, I would start seeing connected threads, you know, so I appreciated, people like, you know, Nina Simone, who not only made beautiful music, but also like was an activist. And then, you know, you look at James Baldwin, which is so much I could say about him, you know. And then I would look at even like, you know, we were talking about Milestone Comics, you know, which was Black comic creators coming together to create comics that were, yes, entertaining, but also really spoke to what was happening. You know what I mean? So I was seeing all this connective tissue of people not only making things that were artistically great, but they were saying something. They were expressing themselves, their communities, their cultures, you know. So I was like, I can do that. You know what I mean? It kind of felt natural for me once I saw that so many of the things that I appreciated were doing that.
Yes. Cool. Thank you. So let's touch on the art of storytelling. For many experts, storytelling functions as a fundamental tool for shaping perception, influencing behavior, building human connection, transmitting culture, and even propaganda. And certainly, art functions in joy making, mental health healing, or soul transcendence. But Du Bois tells us to be wary of those who try to unpoliticize art. He argues that when we do this, we are languishing in self-delusion or being disingenuous. If we only hold the viewers or spectators responsible for bringing in the political. Because the political is always embedded in the space and thus embedded in the canvas. In his 1926 essay, Criteria Negro Art, Boyce argues that Black art must not be inseparable from propaganda, acting as a tool for political, social, and economic liberation. He asserted that all true art is propaganda, serving to uplift Black people, fight white supremacy, and challenge stereotypes by showcasing the beauty and truth of Black life. So what political ends or transformative themes or motivations about Black life you survey for us in some of your pieces?
So yeah, I can say so much about that. What I would say is this.
One up first.
Sure. If you go to the section art and paintings and drawings, so this series here, like this first, I think 9 pieces are from a series that I did in 2011, and it was the series was called "Formerly Invisible," and it's a reference to a few things. It's definitely a reference to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, where, you know, he was writing about like, the social invisibility that Black people experience in this country. And, you know, there was this documentary clip that I had seen, and this was from the late 60s. And there was a brother who was, so, you know, we all know about the Black Panthers and there's like the big names, but like the party was largely made up of, sorry, this is a long answer.
Go ahead, take your time.
But the party was made up of mostly, and during most points, the people who weren't like big names that were in the newspaper. So this was just an average brother who was a very passionate member of the party. And he kind of gave this speech about what Black people were going through that was like pretty familiar to today. And he said at this point, he was talking about people rising up, gaining consciousness, and he said at that point, formerly invisible men. And that just stuck in my head, like that idea of formerly invisible is taking that idea that Ellison was talking about our social invisibility, but he was turning it around and affirming, you know, that we were not destined to be invisible, you know? So this series, and it's really kind of ongoing. I started in 2011, and I've been more focused on my illustrations since then. I look at this as a series that I'm going to be doing for years to come, because what it's about, some pieces are direct, but like the Serenity pieces and the Rooted pieces, I specifically wanted to represent Black peace. And, you know, the idea, yeah, which is political in itself, you know, in the sense of, you know, because in a side note, sorry, my mind jumps around a lot, but I'm part of Black Dimensions in Art, you know, and Black Dimensions in Art. Yeah, so it's an arts organization that's here in the Capital Region. Just celebrated our 50th anniversary, you know, and one of the things, thank you. But one of the things about Black Dimensions in Art is like it is diverse, right? We have all kinds of people. We got some BDA members here today, but you know, we've got people who create art that is directly political, maybe the way we think about that. And then we have people who are beautiful landscape painters, and their work is no less Black. You know what I mean? Yeah. And so I think about that, and I think about you know, how we use our voice, because, and you know, that Du Bois quote that you were reading, I feel like it gets at the fact that our identities have been politicized so much that we inherently are making political work, you know, and so I think about that diversity. So all that to say, like some of these pieces here, they kind of get at this moment that I was at, I wanted to speak to Black people at peace in, you know, various degrees of peace. I do have other pieces that are more about, you know, struggle or the difficulties. But that was a particular moment when I felt like I and just we collectively kind of needed to also take a breath, you know, and so that was what I was articulating right here.
Cool. Most of us will probably agree that, you know, with all the layered kind of racial implications of our struggle of African people, right, to find peace in that mess, in that environment, is quite revolution, right? All right, so I'm from Detroit, Michigan. a city that has its own stellar heritage of Detroit Black arts, Motown music impact, and fierce Black political identity. I go back home to be with my family as often as I can. On one of those family event occasions, I was sitting at a table with one of my nephews, eating my normal share of soul food offerings, when my nephew broke into an incredulous anti-intellectual tirade of how the Black Panther Party, what wasn't the antithesis of the KK, but held the same positionality and purpose from the perch of the Black community as the KK did for the white community. Anti-intellectual, ignorant, ahistorical, accepted distortion. This is how many people think they know the Black Panther Party, but they don't. It's the same way many people think they comprehend slavery, but they don't. They are dismissed, reduced, and erased authentically in this. All we have to do is say the word Black militant, and everybody else walks on the other side. When I read Eric Lee's commentary on your work in David Walker, The Black Panther Party, a graphic novel history, wherein he uses the language, Walker provides a rather nuanced view of the Black Panther Party, Black Panthers, and correctly sums them up. This is a gorgeously illustrated book that tries to tell the story of this uniquely Black American political movement without falling to the trap of demonizing. Can you discuss how you saw your illustrations as the visual architect in this war of narratives to either correct these distortions, humanize these myths of men, and possibly help us appreciate the value and contribution of the Black Panther Party?
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, I think you said that word nuance, right? And that's what it comes down to, because David F. Walker, my collaborator and friend, we talked a lot about like what we wanted to get across individually and as a collaborative. And we did. We wanted to add dimension. We wanted to make sure that people, whether good or bad, got past whatever kind of cartoon picture they had in their head, that was kind of flat. And we wanted to add shape and dimension to that. And one of the things that we set out to do, if you read the book, early in the book, we really, before we even get into the party, we focus on American history from when the first boats, landed in the Caribbean and then later on American soil to up until the 60s when the party was created. And we did that very intentionally because we felt like to jump into the party and start talking about the people, the events, the words, without really painting a picture of the country that necessitated them, would be a failure. You really have to let people understand this is what what's happening in America. This is what is. Quick side note: the Panthers, they actually Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, when they met at college, one of the things that really drove them to connect and create the Black Panther Party for self-defense in 1966 was police killings of unarmed Black men. Something that is all too familiar today. So I think that is a sobering reminder of the fact that history continues to rhyme, because this is a country that hasn't really atoned for these original sins, and people are, we're shouted down, when we cite what was done and what's continued to happen. You know what I mean? So I say all of that to say, when creating this book about the Panthers, we had to really give context to the world that they were born into, and that also gives context to the complexities of the party as well, So we just wanted to paint as full of a picture. We also wanted it to be a jumping on point for people because, David had originally wanted to focus on Fred Hampton, who is a hero to me. But
You as well.
yeah, but we were wisely, given the advice that because the average public, isn't that aware of Fred Hampton or the Panthers, it would probably be good to start with the overview of the party. So we want this to be something, and we definitely encourage people to go read other things, because when it comes down to it, there's been so much written about the Panthers. A lot of it is autobiographies, biographies, or just individual stories. But we really wanted to do something that was a comprehensive thing, and then people could go on and continue to learn from there.
Yes, thank you for that. I think at least Judas and the Black Messiah, the film that came out, tried to say that served that same purpose, to bring light to the unsung heroism of Fred Hampton. So there's a particular heightened clarity and awareness that Africana Studies curriculum and functionality brings to the world. For me, it's a process, a journey of courage-attuned illumination, what I refer to as the Odyssey caliber of one's Afro life. In doing so, I make students and readers aware there has been historically embedded white, often racist, and biased narrative, one that serves a kind of brainwashed anti-Black purpose. And that consequently, Black practitioners are in the necessary business of counter-narratives to the cultural mythology of white supremacy. Hence, there is a Black epistemic, the way many of us come to know things in the Boysian second sight. And there's a white epistemic, the way many whites have been conditioned or mesmerized to know things, mainly in antagonism of Black or African people. This unavoidably makes me think about your work in Big Jim and The White Boy, an American classic reimagined, illustrated by Marcus Kwame Anderson, which is another one of your graphic novels that poses a radical retelling of Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. What constitutes your role in rethinking historical narratives, and why is this important for us?
So I guess so. The way that it came to be is, again, David and I have finished Black Panther Party. We were, talking about what we wanted to do next, and our publisher was interested in, doing reimaginings of, works of literature, and so David had kind of had the seeds of this idea, and when it came down to it, my personal relationship with Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was, I was familiar with it in the way that a lot of people are. Maybe, it's on TV one afternoon, or, you're made to read it in class. And it's, I think the big thing that puts it in the news a lot over especially the last 20 years, is the use of racial slurs, which, I think that's definitely a good debate to be had. I think that the characterization of Jim, the Black character in this story, and the original story, to me, just his characterization is as much of an issue or more than the language, in the sense that he's presented very one-dimensionally. Also, as a visual artist, I'm sorry, there's another long answer. As a visual artist, the original illustrator of that book, is a dude named, I'm not going to say his name, but anyway, he, in addition to illustrating books like Huckleberry Finn, he also was a newspaper cartoonist, did political cartoons, and a lot of them were these really offensive, disgusting caricatures of Black people, like the worst stuff, And he simultaneously was working with Mark Twain, who, for whatever criticism you may have of Twain, he did intend for that book to be an anti-slavery book. He did intend for it to be something somewhat progressive that moved things forward. So I think it kind of speaks to what you were speaking about that. I forget how to put it, but it's like that idea of kind of white supremacy existing in spaces. And so even Mark Twain, with his good intentions, had teamed up with a really racist illustrator, who was really, in a lot of ways, not helping in the effort of, dismantling white supremacy. So I say all that to say that I never really had a big attachment to that story. So when David brought up the idea of reimagining it from Jim's perspective, adding dimension and making this a story that instead of ignoring enslavement, actually really tackles what the lives of enslaved people were, enslaved families, Underground Railroad, all of these things, I was like, yeah, this is like a no-brainer. These are the questions. Because when I watch things, when I read things, I have a million questions. I have an inquisitive mind. And so something like Huckleberry Finn, the questions in my mind are the same ones that David had. Like, why would an escaped enslaved man be going further south? You know what I mean? Like, why is he following Huck? You know what I mean? So we really sought to make them real people, if that makes sense.
What?
Yeah,
That's first
yeah.
base.
So the way that we reframed it in our story is Jim and Huck are real people in the real world, and they coexist in the same world that Mark Twain does. So, Jim and Huck at the ages of Jim's 102, Huck is 92. They're basically telling their true story. They're telling what really happened, and Jim's like, because in real life there was precedent for that because Mark Twain would often borrow from real people's stories that he came across. And so in our story, he did the same thing with Jim and Huck, so they're setting their story straight. But what we're able to do through that mechanic is basically not be tied to following the original events of the book and kind of create our own story in the 1800s. A story that allows them to do things like be involved with the Underground Railroad, the Union Army, and also meet other historical figures and really get into real history, even though it's a fictional story based on a fictional story. And in doing that, central to that was humanizing Jim. And in humanizing Jim, it wasn't just Jim the individual. It was really building out his family, for generations. So it's really a Black family story as well. And then there's something that I won't spoil at the end that takes that strong focus on Black family throughout generations, and it expands it to something that's relatable to everybody. But the focus is definitely on Blackness, on Jim and his thing.
I also see the possibility of creating a new lineage for Jim in that reimagined event, right? Authors could come behind that, borrow your idea, they take Jim's other place.
Yeah.
I think I might have a little time to squeeze this last question. Okay. So when I think about your work, the work, your partnerships, collaborations, or co-creator content with David Walker, I can't help but be reminded of the founders of Milestone Media, as we talked about before. The great team of Dwayne McDuffie, Michael Davis, Garrett T. Dingle, Dennis Cohen, and initially Christopher Priest. Milestone is now an imprint of DC's superhero canon. Milestone helped change the face of comics in ways that go far beyond the sheer amount of talent who worked for the company. Milestone creators wanted to make comics about the real issues faced in Black existential condition or lived experience. They sought to expand what comics could be for the lives and readership of non-white communities. Their books dealt with several issues that were not always represented at the forefront of white male centrality. They asked questions about the police and the rule of law, poverty, gentrification, state violence, and the importance of found family. They even managed to question our own narrowness of the unlimited superhero concept. How do you see your comics expanding what comics can be for Black lives and for the shift in centering and thus valuing others in the mono-ethnic default we have been made accustomed to?
So, I mean, first, I high school when Wild Swan Comics came out, and it is 100% part of my story as far as being on the stage right now. Like, I had loved comics previously. I loved drawing. I dabbled in making my own little comics as a kid. But when I saw a milestone, and I saw these Black creators telling these stories, it just really showed me possibility. You know what I mean? So the first answer to your question is I have been fortunate enough to kind of speak to younger people who have read something that I've created and who are creative people themselves and spoke about being inspired to continue their work. And to me, that's what it is. That's everything. Being part of that lineage, it's not even about me individually shaking up the world. It's about the fact that I'm part of something bigger, and I'm gonna pay that forward the same way that reading those works really inspired me, And I think that's what it is. It's I've definitely I'm fortunate to know a lot of really revolutionary minded, just creative, wonderful Black people making comments right now. And we support each other. We find different ways to just big each other up and to really lift each other, and I think that's what it is. It's not just me, it's not just David, it's all of us. And I see that, so I know what it was to be a kid and be the same age that Static was in the book. You know what I mean? So I was a little creative, nerdy Black kid, and there's this superhero that's my age, you know what I mean, that doesn't look that different from me.
I can dig.
Yeah, I just felt like I was weirdly reading a book that was about me if I had happened to have inhaled radioactive gas that made me have electrical powers.
Yeah.
So so it's just it's the idea of us as kind of this bigger idea, which is really what's kind of kept us as a people going and thriving throughout colonization, throughout enslavement, throughout everything that's brought us here to the West. Whether it's here in the United States, whether it's throughout the Caribbean, these are the things that we brought with us and that we carry. And so creatively, it only makes sense to continue that.
Indeed. I wish someone would find out, though, or do a study on why all the Black superheroes or African American characters have electrical powers. Static Shock, Black Lightning. I mean, it's up to you. So at this time, I'd like to open it up to the audience. If you have any comments that you'd like to present to the great gentleman. Thank you so much.
My question is about the Black Panther graphic novel history that you worked on. Did you have the opportunity to interview any Little Panthers? And if you did that have that influence in your approach?
Yeah, so I actually just got this question last week. So I didn't, and the reason, and it's not that I didn't want to, what it was so David had exhaustively researched. He had spoken to some people in the party. They advised him when he was looking to kind of get in touch with other Panthers to, that there were divides that were created. And that's a longer story. I could just literally spend the rest of the time just talking about that. I'll say the short version of the divides is through the interference of FBI and COINTELPRO, there was just so many efforts to create these rifts. Some of them didn't work, many of them did. And so, long story short, there are, I see a lot of Panthers walking around today, and there's intense beefs, generations deep. So basically, David was advised that continue doing the research, but just be advised that some of these risks can like impact the information you get and everything. So I didn't. I've been fortunate, like since the book came out, to I've heard from some people, because one thing I didn't mention before is that when I first got the news that we were going to do the book, I was like really excited. And then when the excitement died down, I was like terrified, just because of the fact that it's like felt like this huge responsibility, and also like it's one thing if you're doing a history book about the 1800s, but if you're doing a book about the Panthers, it's like the people you're representing are still walking this earth, So it's like I also culturally just felt a need to get things right. So I feel fortunate that everybody that I've heard from, it's been good things. I haven't heard any bad things from anybody in the world.
Cool. Next.
I'll just spell something. Do you know Mumia Abu-Jamal? He's my person that I feel like he has it. I know everything about him, and I feel so blessed that I know everything about him. He's empowered me. I read his works, and I just feel like he's a true revolutionary that's been in prison unfairly. And I was just wondering,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know him personally, but in my just journey of learning, definitely. I read Live from Death Row when I was in high school. And to be honest, like, I feel like, it was like Mumia and Asada were like the first two people that I learned about, like long before working on this book, that really kind of inspired me. Their stories inspired me. I love that both Mumia and Asada not only, just awaken the world to the issues that Black people face out in the world, but also in the carceral system, in the ways that like the system can be a weapon against us, you know what I mean? So short answer is yes, 100%. I agree with you. Like Mumia was really an inspiration for me. I read and reread that book and some of his other writings.
All right. Yes.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I am struck by how close in time Big Jim and Percival Everett James broke onto the scene. And I was thinking about, it's not a Toni Morrison playing in the dark because Jim is a very prominent figure in Huck Finn. But I'm wondering, I guess I've got sort of two questions, and they might be the same question. One is, what is the power or attraction of going back to those sort of white books as opposed to creating new books? And the other, which is a slightly different question, is because of what you said about the cartoonist who first illustrated Huck Finn, do you think it would be possible to illustrate the original book, particularly for an artist like you, not necessarily you, but could be you, to illustrate the book in a way that would shift its reception or shift its message?
Yeah, so I guess to the first question, I think the answer to that would be the fact that, I guess we're doing both, I have, and the nature of publishing is that, like, we're working on these books sometimes a couple of years before they happen, and so, and that actually, just side note, yeah, Percival Everett James, like, was an amazing book. I waited to read it till after our book was released. And funny quick story, when I was like halfway through the book, I think I had a year and a half to draw it. My editor reached out and was like, "Hey, can you get the book done 6 months early?" And I was like, "No, why?" And then she told me that like one of my favorite authors was doing a book that was also reimagined. So that was I think that it ended up being a good thing because it's the books. They're not the same, they can, yeah, I feel like in an educational setting, it's an incredible opportunity to contrast them against the original book, and both of the ways in which, we deviated from the original book. But to answer your question, like, I think we are doing that. Like, like even this event being, celebrating, Black speculative fiction, there's so much of that. And, I have at least 10 stories up here in my head that that I want to tell at the coming years. So I think there's room for that. But I think the revisiting grows out of the fact that we are all stewing in, sitting in this stew of certain people getting to be heroes and certain people getting to be the best friend who sometimes dies. Jim survived in the original one, but he never got back together with his family. You don't really know anything about it, you know what I mean? So it's really just that scratching that itch of those questions. To your second question, I think that the words are central, because in the original text, there still are, even if somebody like really represented Jim well on a visual level, but it was accompanying the same story, for me, I don't think it would solve the issues that we were setting out to solve. Because, the meat of the story had some of those flaws.
Can I add a little bit to that? With all Mark Twain's abolitionist intent, there's maybe some limitations with regard to Twain as well, right? Yeah. And so the thing about many Black practitioners, as I say, he's my favorite man, Du Bois. Du Bois encourages us to have a corrective responsibility. So when you go back and look at these things again, you correct those kind of racist historical implications. And certainly they do that by humanizing the artwork first and foremost. So that's why we go back and get those things. We have to correct kind of like racist stuff that's been done to the demonization of Black people. Yes.
I have a comment. First, thank you. Well, what you just said about Du Bois is what makes Du Bois an Afrofuturist. Because if you think about the notion of Afrofuturism being a reclamation and also at the same time a remix, because this word, Big Jim and the White Boy, is a remix of this original story, right? But it also reclaims the narrative of this Black man, this Black male character who had this very specific role, but centering him and making him fully human. I have now read it twice. So thank you for that work. But as talked about and discussed this morning, when Beatrice Moore was talking about Afrofuturism outside of, technology, or what we see as technology, right? Or space or music, right? It's also about time. And if we have, now we're in this time, but we can reach back to thinking about the things that Du Bois said in his time and all that go back and correct or, again, remix things from times before. So thinking about that, right, and how, Afrofuturism didn't start with Mark Derry's, definition in 1993. It did not start there. But if we're looking at the ways in which, I'll specifically say Black Americans have taken what has been imposed upon them and used it in a way to push culture forward and to reclaim time, then I think that's what it really is all about.
Reclaiming time, yeah.
Yeah, and can I briefly? Okay, I just want to say, you know what? I think I'll just leave it there. You said it perfectly. So yeah.
I was just curious about if you had the ability to gain the IP, the intellectual property rights of any comic book character you wanted to begin a story arc tomorrow, who would you choose and why?
I think is it possible to, in the spirit of Dr. Torment, to remix the question just a little bit?
Yeah.
Can it be just even, can it go beyond comics? Can it be like anything?
Sure.
I think that, and maybe it's been done, but it hasn't sparked outrage. I think being a person, grew up in America, but is of Caribbean descent. I've been looking into Jamaican liberation, and I think about Haiti, and I think about Toussaint Louverture, and I feel like that would be a fascinating story to tell, and also in a way where it wasn't just telling history, but also maybe looking at the reverberations afterwards. So that's one. And I feel like also, I don't know, I think I'd like to do, in a weird way, it's like I love doing historical work, but I think it's just these characters. I had these fictional characters that I haven't gone to yet. So yeah, I know that's not a fun answer, but I feel like probably Toussaint, or maybe somebody related to Jamaican liberation.
You and David should take on Tucson, next graphic novel project.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have to end it there. Our great timekeeper has given us the stop message. So we really thank you all. I think this is a robust discussion, wonderful audience vibe, and look forward to the next part of the session. Thank you so much.